Among ancient Egypt's most famous remnants is its massive corpus of literature, from papyri to engraved ostraca to massive monumental constructions. It is thanks to the hieroglyphs, the fact that they were very often carved and thus survived to the modern day, that we know as much as we do about the ancient Egyptians and the way they lived. A written record of almost any pre-modern society, of course, is by definition incomplete. The literate are only ever a segment of society, and they write only what's deemed important to write. It's contrasted almost exactly with the modern day, where we're almost all literate and we write constantly, but we write with a medium that depends upon the generation of electricity. If civilization's great cycles turn against us, only our hard copies will remain, and paper isn't forever. Hieroglyphs remained in use long after the dynastic age, long into the Christianization of Egypt, but they were not Egypt's only writing system. They emerged from symbol-bearing tokens not dissimilar to how Mesopotamian cuneiform or Chinese Hansa evolved out of pretty literal images of the things depicted, eventually becoming writing rather than drawing. The oldest complete sentences we can read to this day are written in hieroglyphs, and are dated to the reign of Peribsen, who reigned somewhere in the 2700s BCE during Egypt's second dynasty. Sometime after that, in the third dynasty, the hieroglyphs and their use were formalized. The system remained almost completely unchanged for over 2,000 years. Remarkable for an everyday spoken language, but that's not what the hieroglyphs were. Think of Latin. Latin hasn't changed much in the same span of time. The difference, and what makes Egyptian remarkable, is that Latin has been unchanging because it's dead. Hieroglyphs represented a living language. Or did they? The short answer is more or less. Think of the last time you read terms and conditions or a contract. It was probably written in what you might call legalese. It was written in your language, but a register of your language probably nobody would use in everyday speech. The hieroglyphs were similar. The sociolect, which is like a dialect but employed by a particular class of people within a society, the sociolect was very formal. It had a grammar and syntax of its own, trapped by the formalities of the system, while the spoken language mutated, as they always do. Hieroglyphs were not always carved in this precise way. When written on paper, a bookhand was used. Not quite a cursive script, but as you can see here, some of the more complex signs are simplified. On stone, a hieroglyph was stenciled, then corrected, then resized or adjusted as the layout demanded, before finally being painstakingly carved. On papyrus, wood, or clay, this process was some combination of unnecessary and undesirable. This is from the Papyrus of Ani, which was the personalized Book of the Dead created for Ani, who was a senior scribe. Hieroglyphs continued to be written until the late 4th century CE, although by then they were written only very rarely, used in a religion that had almost been eradicated. Just as old as the hieroglyphs was a script used by the literate classes to write texts that had what we would call a secular function, though the Egyptians certainly would not have considered anything to have been secular. Nowadays, following the example of the Greeks, we call it hierarchic, which just means priestly. Hierarchic, unlike the bookhand we just saw, is truly cursive, with the original forms of the hieroglyphs much more distantly discernible. You see hierarchic used in letters, legal texts, medical texts, literature, and some religious writings. Hieratic, unlike the hieroglyphs, was designed to be inked rather than carved. Hieratic reads from right to left, and from around 2000 BCE was almost exclusively written horizontally. Hieroglyphs, by contrast, could be written in either horizontal direction and could be oriented vertically. As time went on, hieratic took on a life of its own, becoming the primary written language taught to those privileged to learn to write, as hieroglyphs remained with a very select elite few. Hieratic endured beyond the dynastic age as well, though as far as we know, not quite as late on as the hieroglyphs themselves. Living a separate life from the hieroglyphs and being taught to a wider range of people gave hieratic an evolutionary edge, and an even more cursive, even further hieroglyphically divorced script came came into use. It saw an expansion of its use in official documents under the rule of the First Persian Empire, and when Egypt was briefly reunified in between Persian conquests, this script, known later by the term demotic, became the official writing system of administrative, legal, and mercantile documents. Hierarchic continued its use in temples, but demotic was the writing system of, and again I use this word with asterisks, secular Egypt. We call it demotic because Herodotus called it that. It comes from the Greek term demotikos, meaning popular, because it was widely taught among non-priestly scribes, which had become a large class in society since the New Kingdom. When the Ptolemaic dynasty ruled, demotic was even used in religious and literary contexts, though during this time, Egyptian was itself being supplanted by Greek as the administrative language. Demotic outlasted hieroglyphs, or at least the latest example of demotic we have is a little newer than the latest example of hieroglyphs and is dated to the 12th of December 452 CE. Yet, even as demotic faded out of use, characters from it were borrowed for the creation of a writing system still used to this day. There were many things that couldn't simply be translated into Greek, and it wasn't always possible to write Egyptian using the Greek alphabet. It was important to try to do so as a Hellenic elite took increasing power in Egypt, and this tension gave birth to the script we now know as Coptic. Coptic gets its name ultimately from the Greek word Aiguptos, which we've discussed in previous videos, was a name the Greeks gave to the nation of Egypt that ultimately derives from the name for a temple to the god Ptah. Coptic inherited a few really interesting linguistic features from Greek. Most notably to us, it reads left to right, and, crucially, it writes down the vowels. Now, the variation in how these vowels are pronounced across Coptic's numerous dialects has helped a great deal in reconstructing older forms of the Egyptian language, though of course lacking a time machine, we have no ability to confirm any of these reconstructions. Coptic was primarily based on the Greek alphabet, though there were some sounds that the Greek alphabet of course could not render, and for those sounds, Coptic took characters from demotic, and therefore there are a small handful of Coptic characters that ultimately derive from the hieroglyphs. Coptic limped on in various dialects, becoming increasingly obscure until reaching extinction about 200 years ago. It's a liturgical language now, sharing a fate with Latin and, until recently, Hebrew. Looking at it, you can see the relationship with Greek is pretty obvious, and you'd even be forgiven for thinking that it has a close relationship with the Cyrillic script. It doesn't, but they're not unrelated. The thing that I've glossed over is that these writing systems weren't all used for the same language. A second dynasty pharaoh wouldn't understand spoken Coptic any more than most of us today would understand the phrase Fada ura thuthe erton heavenum siethin name Yahalrod, even though that phrase is in a language called, by its native speakers, English. Stages of a spoken language are harder to codify without audio recordings, and written evidence is at best an imperfect gauge for how it was spoken. I made this chart, which very roughly shows the intersection of the different writing systems. This diagram would get even more gnarly if I included our best guesses about when the various spoken stages of Egyptian emerged, and of course that long hieroglyphs line doesn't show how the hieroglyphic vocabulary ballooned in the Ptolemaic period. This also doesn't take into account other languages used in Egypt. As I said before, Greek was used in the Ptolemaic period, and this continued in the Roman period because Latin didn't really catch on in Egypt. It also doesn't show how common each writing system was as they waxed and waned over time, but you can see the influence of things like the Persian conquest and the erosion of the Egyptian language during early Roman rule and the onset of Christianity. I'll conclude by saying that we of European descent take alphabets for granted, but clearly there are many alternative ways of writing a language. Ancient Egyptian, like modern Japanese, employed multiple scripts, each with their own functions, and even as the spoken vernacular changed, these parallel writing systems are our stepping stones back to the earliest days of Egyptian. The months of the Coptic calendar, for example, still use the names of the Egyptian gods. They still call Egypt Keme, and even to this day, in Coptic, it is Re that shines overhead. This was a very brief overview of written Egyptian. Each one of these scripts deserves an in-depth look, and we'll probably get it on this channel. Be sure to tell me which of these writing systems you want me to have a deeper look at first. I try not to do too much linguistic stuff. That's a rabbit hole I could easily fall down, but there's plenty of it and it isn't going anywhere. Until next time, my fellow armchair Egyptologists, life, prosperity and health to you all. Thanks for watching. Head over to my channel for more, or click here to see what the YouTube demons think you should watch next. I hope you'll consider subscribing. If you'd like to support and collaborate on the channel with me, go to patreon.com/armchairegypt. You can also join my Discord community, there's an invite link in the description.